So thank you. So as Tobbe said, my name is Sanny. I work as a teacher in this game design and programming at the University of Skövde, where I'm also the coordinator of the game design education. And on the side, as a hobby, I also make board games and computer games together with some of my colleagues. Partly because I want to make sure that I actually know what I'm talking about when I teach these things, but mostly because making games is super fun. You should all try it sometime. So one of my former students asked me earlier today what I was going to talk about, and I answered that I will talk about the same things that I always talk about, which is uncertainty and randomness, because that's probably my favorite topic in game design. I find that uncertainty, the inability of players to completely predict how a game will go on and turn out, is one of the, if not the most important characteristic of games. And one of the main reasons that many of us play games is to experience this uncertainty. And I'm by far the only person who thinks this. It's common to have game design textbooks talk about this, and Greg Kostikian actually wrote a whole book on this topic. So uncertainty is crucial for games. I see it as sort of their lifeblood. Without uncertainty, we don't have games, really. So games need uncertainty, and uncertainty can come from many different sources. It could be that the game is so complex that we can't actually visualize how the game will play out until its end, like in chess. Or it could be that I'm not sure if I'm skilled enough to manage this shortcut that I'm trying to take in Mario Kart. Or it could just be that I don't know how the dice will fall in a game of backgammon or Monopoly. So there are many sources of uncertainty, and there could probably be multiple talks about each and every one of them. But my favorite one is randomness, which is the subject of today. And randomness is an incredibly simple way and also powerful way to add uncertainty to your game. And it's probably the simplest one and the one that new designers sort of by default turn to when they're adding uncertainty to their games. But from a player perspective, it's also a sort of uncertainty that feels arbitrary in that it's outside the player's control. The players can't control randomness. That's sort of the definition of randomness. Now, this can be a positive in many games. If you're playing Peggle, you probably wouldn't want to sit down for minutes and carefully plan out the ball's trajectory before you actually launch it. And you definitely don't want to control the ball as it's bouncing around the playing field. You just want to sort of go with your gut when you're aiming, launch the ball, and then cross your fingers, hoping that it will hit the correct pegs and then drop into the bucket at the bottom. But if you ask a strategy game player about randomness, they will probably tell you that they don't want it in their game, and then they will go on to tell you about this XCOM run they had, where they had the perfect plan for the mission, and then they lost it just because they missed the shot that had 99% to hit, right? So the default reaction, so to speak, in strategy games to randomness is that it's bad for strategy games. But there are strategy games with a lot of randomness, and I think randomness can present strategy game players with very satisfying challenges, and that randomness can actually be very skill testing if you design your game around randomness. So when I make games, especially strategy games, this is sort of my guiding principle. I see design of strategy games as the design of good decision scenarios. And I believe that a well-designed strategy game should provide its players with context-dependent decisions that have consequences that are distinct from one another, they are meaningful, and they should be suitably uncertain. And to to explain what I mean by all these terms, I have this model that I use for thinking about decisions and also for teaching about decisions in my courses. So this is me trying, probably unsuccessfully, to find the best move in Quacks of Quedlinburg, a very good board game. And when I make a decision, I have these alternatives. And if it's a well-designed game, I have very clear alternatives so that I know what my options are. And they, depending on which option I choose in this decision, the game will continue in different ways. My decision will hopefully affect the consequences in the game itself. And the information that I use to make this decision is I sort of separated into 3 different buckets or 3 different types. I need to have knowledge about the context of the decision. And this is mainly the state of the game as it is when I'm making the decision. But it could also be like more meta information such that I know that this player who I'm playing poker with is a very tight player, so I should probably alter my strategy to take advantage of that. So it's mostly the game state, but it could also be other things which are relevant for the current situation. I think having decisions be context dependent is absolutely crucial for strategy game design, because that means that if I get to the same type of decision situation multiple times, perhaps in multiple different games, then it will not be the same alternative that is the correct one in every situation, because the context is important enough to change which option I choose, right? So context is one of the information sources that I use to make a decision. The other one is my knowledge about the game system. And if it's a board game, then it's more or less the rule book, and I probably have a decent view of almost all of it. I know all the game's rules. If it's a computer game, I most likely don't have full information about the game system because I haven't written the game's code. I don't know absolutely everything about the game. And that's particularly true for real-time games, where I probably have a very, very vague view of the game's systems, at least in the beginning. And then the third information source that I use to make my decision is heuristics, which is sort of my strategy know-how. That is my rules of thumb for making good decisions in perhaps this particular game, or in this genre of games, or just in games in general. So I use all of this information, and then I try to choose the alternative that gives me the best chance of winning the game. And once I've chosen one of the alternatives, that will change how the game plays out in the future. And sort of the process of making a good decision is trying to visualize how my decision will affect the continuation of the game. And if it's a good decision situation, then my choice will have significant effect on the rest of the game. And in a strategy game, you want your players to be able to sort of predict what will happen in the game when players make a certain decision. But you also don't want the players to be able to visualize the game in its entirety so that they know exactly how the game will play out until its end, right? Because once I know exactly how a game will play out, there's no uncertainty left in the game, and the game is sort of dead to me. So unless the game finishes very quickly after this, I will lose my interest in the game session. So we need a force that sort of pushes this prediction horizon, how far I can see into the game's future, further back towards the current moment. And that force is uncertainty. Uncertainty makes it harder for me to predict how a game will play out. And so this is how I think about decisions in games. And I think randomness is relevant for 2 parts of this model. It's it's relevant for context. Randomness can affect the game's context, and then as a consequence, my decisions. And obviously, it also affects uncertainty. It makes the game harder to predict. And those two types of randomness are kind of distinct from one another. And there are terms for them in game design discourse. And they are called input randomness and output randomness. So input randomness is when I have random elements that affect the context of a decision. So it's randomness that happens before I make a decision. So it could be the first roll on my turn in Yahtzee, and then I roll the dice, and then I use the information that I get from the dice roll to determine which dice to re-roll, or if I want to keep them all, which line on my score sheet that I'm going to fill in. Or it could be the random map generation in Civilization. So I get a random starting position, and then I need to make a decision of where to put my first city. So input randomness is randomness that affects the decision before it's made. And then, obviously, output randomness is randomness that happens afterwards, when I've already made my decision and can't control it anymore. So it could be that I make an attack in a Fire Emblem game, and I don't know if I will get a critical hit or not. Or it could be that I'm doing a skill check in Arkham Horror, the card game, and then I need to reach into this chaos bag and pull out a token, which determines whether I succeed or not. So I think these two types of randomness feel very distinct from one another, and they have very different uses in game design. But the line between them is, as in so many other cases, kind of blurry, because the output randomness of one decision can merge into or morph into the input randomness of future decisions in the game. So that's an argument for why there might not exist input and output randomness, but since they both feel so different and are used in such different scenarios, I think it's a useful distinction to make anyway. So now that we've established some terms on this topic, I want to move on to... Oh, no, I have this slide first. Sorry, I'm moving on too fast. So input randomness and output randomness, if you contrast them, input randomness can be used to make your decision situations feel varied. You can have a different context each time you make a certain decision. Input randomness sort of can be seen as generating puzzles for your players to solve. So each bridge hand that I'm dealt sort of presents me with a new puzzle that I need to solve. So for that reason, input randomness encourages players to analyze. They get a random deal, and then they need to work out how to do the best they can with that deal. The downside of front-loading your randomness in this way is that if you get a bad draw in a card game, for example, then it can feel hopeless because, okay, I know that things aren't going to get better. I just have to deal with this hand of cards that I got. Output randomness, on the other hand, can lead to very exciting moments in a way that input randomness really can't. It could be that our last chance of winning this Arkham scenario is that someone makes a skill check and pulls the Elder Sign out of the Chaos bag, which is a very low probability. But when it happens, it's a high-five moment, right, that you will remember for years and probably talk to your friends about. And that can't really happen with input randomness, but output randomness is very good at generating these kinds of memorable moments. Output randomness also sort of gives players a license not to analyze too much, because since they can't know exactly how things will play out due to the randomness, they sort of just tend to go with their gut instead of trying to predict every possible outcome of a decision. The downside to this in strategy games is that it can feel pretty frustrating not to be in control of your fate. And it makes the game sort of more unstrategic. And another consequence of output randomness is that makes it harder for players to learn how to play a game well, because it adds a lot of noise to the feedback that the game gives the players from their decisions. I can make a horrible bet in poker and get handsomely rewarded by the game just due to output randomness. And that probably teaches me a lesson that I would be better off not learning, right? So output randomness sort of makes games messier or harder to learn. Now that we have talked enough about these concepts, I can move on to talk about the main thing for today, which is a game called Circadian Dice, which I made together with some of my colleagues, one of which is sitting over there. Aslan made the graphics for this game. So almost everyone involved here is a teacher at the University of Skövde, except for Alexander Zelonov, who makes awesome free-to-use music and puts it on the internet for us to use. You probably haven't heard of this game because it's a hobby project that we haven't really marketed at all. But it's been available on itch.io since last year, and this spring it actually got pretty popular because a lot of indie game streamers picked the game up. And since then we've had a still small but very enthusiastic following. And actually the game is still the top-rated and top-selling turn-based strategy game on itch.io. So before I move on to talk about our design decisions in Circadian Dice, I wanted to just briefly tell you how the game is played. So in this game, you choose one of 8 characters, and then you take them on an adventure in one of the game's scenarios. And your goal is to survive waves of enemies and then defeat the boss at the end of the scenario. So in this case, I've chosen the Demonologist, and they are trying to survive 8 waves of dinosaurs and beat the boss dinosaur at the end of the scenario. The main mechanic in this game is dice building, which is the player has 4 dice to their disposal, of which 2 are unlocked at the beginning. Can you see this cursor? Yeah, this is the 6 sides of the first die the player has, and these are the 6 sides of the second die. Each turn the player rolls their dice, and they can re-roll them up to 2 times. And then when they keep, they can use the resources on the faces that they have currently rolled. So in this case, I could use the sword to attack one of the enemies for 1 damage, and I would get 1 gold, which I can use to buy stuff later on. And there are other things, such as the gems you can see on some faces are used to activate the abilities that a player has. But perhaps the most important resource here is the gold, because that's used to buy new faces for the player's dice. So in this case, we can buy this top upgrade, and the upgrade is sort of like a domino tile, which you have to buy both of them at once, and then you can rotate them as you wish and put them onto 2 adjacent sides on your dice, and then you replace the previous content of those sides and get the new ones. And then the game behaves sort of like you would expect. After each turn, each of the enemies attack you, and if you lose all your health, you die, more or less. So obviously there are a lot of other mechanics in the game, but those are the central ones, and what I am going to discuss later on. So the game is centered around dice, right? And everyone likes dice, but dice have a problem, which is that they are very random, which is sort of obvious, right? But they are random in a way that, for example, a deck of cards isn't. So if I play a deck building game like Slay the Spire and add a new card to my deck, then I will draw that card exactly once every time I go through the deck, right? If I buy a new side for one of my dice, then I might never roll that side for the entirety of the game, or I might roll it 10 times in a row. And there's a big discrepancy between those 2 cases. We have a lot of variance in a game just by introducing dice instead of, for example, a deck of cards into the game. Also, dice are sort of an icon of randomness. So as soon as a player sees that this game is about dice, they sort of get this preconception that the game is all about randomness. It's entirely random. And with this game, we were actually aiming for a strategy game player audience. We wanted the game to actually be strategic and have a very high skill ceiling for strategy players. And we were worried that just by having dice as the main mechanic, we would sort of scare off everyone who wanted a more skill testing experience. Lastly, players are sort of suspicious of computers rolling dice for a good reason, sort of. I don't know if you listened to Rami's talk yesterday, where he said that if a game rolls a die, then they don't do it randomly. They try to help the player, or at least meet the player's expectations. So computer games tend to fudge randomness in the player's favor, but players tend to suspect that the computer fudges the results to their disadvantage. If a player rolls badly several times in a row, they start suspecting the computer of cheating them and making the game unnecessarily hard for them. So we had all of this in the back of our minds as we were making the game, and it didn't get better when this game was launched, which is called Tharsis. It's a great board game-like computer game where the player is on a mission to Mars and they're trying to survive all these disasters that happen on the journey there. And the tools that they have to do this is a set of dice. This game, I find, has a very high skill ceiling. You can definitely learn to play this game extremely well and win almost every run of the game, regardless of how the dice roll for you. But the game was met with very harsh reactions. It got a lot of negative comments, like the game is deliberately rolling low to make my life miserable. It was a common theme among the comments, and players even said that it doesn't matter what I do in the game. My decisions don't matter because it all boils down to getting lucky with the dice in the end. So the developers actually changed their description of the game on the Steam page into what is more or less just, please try our game. It's possible to win even if you roll badly. So this worried us a bit, and we were concerned that having good or bad luck with the dice would be too influential on the player's success in the game, that the strategy would be overshadowed by the randomness. And we sort of tried to solve this in a possibly unintuitive way, because we decided to add more randomness to the game, which sort of sounds weird. If we're worried about the impact of randomness, why add more of it? But at least in my brain, this sort of makes sense, because if you just have one die roll in your game, then all of the results will be equally likely. We can just as likely be super unlucky and roll a 1 and be super lucky and roll a 6. So if I have to balance my game around all of the possible outcomes, then it sort of becomes necessary that the die roll becomes insignificant. But if we add just one more die, then we get a likely result, which is the average result of both dice. And the likelihood of being very unlucky, rolling 2 1s, and being very lucky and rolling 2 6s becomes much more unlikely than just rolling near the average. So now that we have this more convenient sort of shape of the results curve, we can start designing our systems in the game around this distribution, like in Catan, where the resource generation is built around this property of 2 6-sided dice. And as we add more and more dice to the game, this shape of the curve becomes more pronounced. So if we have 100 die rolls, then the in almost every case when we're playing this game, the result will be within the middle sixth of this results space. So you can see this curve as sort of the luck curve, where in a run where the player has an average amount of luck, they will be in the middle. Right? Do you buy this reasoning, sort of? Yeah, okay, great. So what did we do to add randomness to the game? Well, a lot of stuff. For example, enemies can randomly drop chests, which, if you manage to open them, give you resources. Some abilities have a chance of just refunding the cost you paid to use them. Upgrades in the shop can randomly go on sale so that you can buy them for half price. And at the end of each wave, you get to choose between a randomly generated set of rewards, which gives you resources or new abilities, or even help you remove debuffs from your dice, and so on. So those could either be very good, like getting 5 gold, which is awesome, or they could be almost useless, like if you would get a single white gem. So this was our way of trying to force the game into this shape where we could design around the average. So we could tweak the difficulty so that it was possible to win the game even if you were reasonably unlucky. If you would get extremely unlucky and be in the sort of leftmost part of this graph, then you would probably lose the scenario very quickly and you would have to restart. But that would generally be very unlikely, and it would happen pretty quickly. So we didn't worry too much about that situation, even though it's unfortunate when it happens. What we did worry more about was that since we wanted to make sure that, at least in the game's normal mode, the player could win almost every time, when the player did get very lucky, winning sort of became trivial or too easy for our tastes. So we wanted some way of pushing this line back. If the player gets very lucky in a session, then we wanted some way of making the game harder for them. And the way we tried to do this was by adding a third option to the end of wave rewards, which happens if you manage to cleanly defeat every enemy in the wave. So if you choose this third option, the only thing you get is a higher score. So it's a way of increasing your score, and you also get a streak bonus, which increases every time you choose the score reward without choosing anything else in between. So it sort of encourages you to take risks instead of resources, especially when you're feeling that you're having a good run and perhaps don't need the extra resources. So this was a way of giving the player a tool to make the game harder for themselves in situations where the game was becoming too easy. And vice versa, if the player was very unlucky, they could take the resources instead and get sort of a helping hand for the remainder of the run. So that's one of the mechanics we used. The other one is sort of trying to do the same thing. At the end of each scenario, the player gets a score bonus, which is proportional to the amount of gold that they have saved. So this rewards the player for stopping to buy upgrades for their dice when they feel that they have enough, their dice are good enough to finish the run. So once again, it's sort of a risk-reward mechanic that encourages the player to make the game harder if it's getting too easy. So instead of having our game like fudge the die rolls behind the scenes, we're actually putting it into the player's hands so that they can do this at the rate which is right for their skill level in the game. There was, in early versions, a problem with this. And the problem was that players didn't care about the score. They just wanted to finish the scenarios. They ignored the score bonuses. So the final thing we had to do to actually make this mechanic work was to connect the scores to the game's unlocks by giving players stars related to the score that they got at the end of a scenario. So everything that unlocks in the game, more or less, is connected to the stars that the player has collected. So new scenarios become unlocked as you get more stars, new characters, and new relics, which are things you can take on a run to give you permanent bonuses, and so on. Once we did this, players got very interested in getting high scores, to a point that it actually became a problem, which we will talk about soon. So those were the two mechanics that we used in order to massage this difficulty curve into something which made the game sort of equally difficult each time it was run. There were also some design principles that we used for almost all of our design decisions in the game. We wanted to have a focus on input randomness and give the players tools to actually react to bad rolls or bad luck in the game. We do have some output randomness in some cases, but it's been sort of carefully chosen, and we've tried to stay away from very binary outcomes of output randomness, like when a player either succeeds or fails in something. I mean, you could argue that each die roll has output randomness, and you would be right, but the dice in this game don't tell you that you have failed or succeeded. You can't really get bad things from a die roll. So when the output randomness of a die roll is just determining how much of the good things you get, right? There is one exception, which is the trap mechanics. You can buy traps for your dice, which allow you to use them sort of like Pokeballs. You can capture enemies in your dice. And we didn't find a way to do this without having a pass-fail output randomness test. So traps can either succeed or fail in capturing an enemy, but we try to at least mitigate the negative reactions to a failure by giving you a bonus for future capture attempts with the same trap if you fail. We tried to have all of these new random mechanics that we added give the players bonuses rather than penalties. Almost everything that you can get randomly in the game is good for you. And to offset this very random set of player-centered mechanics, we wanted the enemy mechanics to be extremely predictable. So all the scenarios have predefined waves of enemies, so they will be exactly the same every time you play them. And also, you know exactly in which order enemies attack and exactly how much damage they will deal to you each turn. So those principles sort of permeated all the design decisions that we made in the game. And we also made some very explicit mechanics that allow players to control the randomness in the game. One of them, I mean, you can argue that the dice upgrading mechanic sort of is a randomness control mechanic because you replace bad sides on your dice with better versions of them. But one type of upgrade in particular is designed to allow control of randomness, and it's the red and white X face that you can see on the rightmost die here. I sort of added this type of side as an analog to trashing cards in deck building games, such as Dominion or Slay the Spire, where you remove things from your deck. This X face is an unrollable face, which can't be rolled at all. So by adding one to your dice, you sort of turn the 6-sided die into a 5-sided die instead. And I didn't really expect so much from this mechanic, but as I've watched people play the game, like streamers, they get unreasonably excited about this die face. They almost to a person start talking about, oh, I want to make a 1-sided die or even a 0-sided die, which will break the game. It doesn't, by the way. The game handles it fine. This really surprised me because I thought this die face is sort of interesting, but it doesn't really do anything. By definition, it does nothing. But players really enjoyed using that mechanic. Also, there are some abilities the player can use to specify a die phase which is guaranteed to be rolled for the next few rerolls, and there are ways of locking dice before rerolling, and also even one that allows you to go back to a previously rolled result if you're unsatisfied with a roll. We also tried to make the runs of this game very short. We were aiming for, as you can see here, 10 to 30 minutes per run, and I believe that we hit that, even if it, of course, depends on the speed of the player. I would say that runs in this game are, on average, 15 to 20 minutes. And I think this is almost necessary. It's a preference of mine to have short runs in games, but for this game in particular, I think it actually was necessary because it encourages players to actually take risks because they haven't invested that much time into a run that they feel that they need to play it safe. And sort of connecting to this is that we have all of these unlocks, and that together with the short runs gives the game a Moorish character that when a player, even if they, either if they lose or win a run, they tend to play a new one directly afterwards. So as a whole, we were very satisfied with the game's systems. In particular, this way of allowing the player to control the difficulty of the game by their decisions works very well from a systems perspective. We're super happy with that. But there are some definite downsides to those mechanics. And one is that once players realize that streaks and score bonuses are a very good way of getting 5 stars on the scenarios, it sort of becomes the dominant choice in that situation. And I've seen many players more or less default to that option and not even register the other alternatives. They choose score every time because they see unlocking all stuff as the ultimate goal of the game. And they also express that they sort of feel bad when they're doing that because the other options are more fun. Picking score isn't in itself very fun. It's fun to unlock stuff, but for the current run, you could probably get a cool ability or some gold instead. And the same thing sort of holds true for the gold bonus. It's fun to spend gold on new die phases because that's what the game is about. Saving the gold for the end and getting a score bonus for it is not as fun, right? It's interesting, but not very fun. I predicted that the short run lengths would lead players to restart runs until they get a good start and then snowball through the scenario, which definitely happens and the game sort of encourages that, but it's actually less of a problem than I imagined it would be because players sort of get invested in a run pretty quickly and then they are unlikely to restart it if they've gotten a good upgrade, for example. So to sum up, these are our takeaways from the game, from designing the game and watching players play it. I think in a strategy game, it's better to have lots of small random results rather than rare and very big ones. I also think that input randomness should be your default choice for adding uncertainty via randomness, and that you should choose your output randomness spots carefully. You should focus on random positive things that you give to the players, and what this does is sort of allow players to build their strategy and run around the things that they got lucky with in this particular run of the game. And my biggest personal takeaway from this that I really didn't expect was how much players love controlling randomness, sort of taking charge of their own fate via these mechanics that change the odds, so to speak. And I think this is a general good design guideline. You should make your game sessions as short as possible, especially if you have a lot of randomness, because that makes players less risk averse and it makes players want to play your game again. And I often tell my students that if one of their playtesters say that, wow, I really like this game, but it was just a bit too short, then your game is probably the correct length. Because the thing they always say afterwards is, I want to play it again. So I think it's definitely much better that someone says that your game is a little too short than that they say that it's a little too long, because that means it's absolutely way too long. And that's more or less it. We are still working on the game. Aslan is making a lot of new graphics for the games that we're planning to add to the game before we launch it, hopefully on Steam in 2022. And sort of accidentally, the game has actually made a decent profit. So we didn't expect this, but now we have to sort of start up a business to handle that, which is by far the most complex thing I've ever done in game development. I don't know how you people do it, basically. And that's it. I'd be happy to take some questions.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Sanny. And if you have any questions, I just want to say there's a microphone in the back, so speak into that, because this is also being streamed, and if you just blurt it out loud, people won't hear it in the stream. So, yeah, if there are any questions, feel free.
Hey, Sanny. Thanks for a great talk and a great game. Are there elements where you fudge the randomness? For example, if a player has low health during a run, is it more likely that they get a health bonus reward or that kind of stuff?
No, there aren't any that I know of. I could have made some by mistake, perhaps, but I'm sort of, okay, this is probably not the answer you're looking for, but I can't help myself. I am of two minds of this fudging of randomness. I absolutely see that you need to sort of accept that players have a very flawed view of randomness and odds in general. And you will probably get many negative reactions if your game is actually truly random. I also think that misunderstanding randomness is a big problem in our modern society, because we have a lot of randomness in our lives, and if we can't accept randomness and learn to handle it and prepare for bad rolls, that we're sort of giving players a disservice if we are sort of playing to their misconceptions and rewarding them and enforcing their misunderstanding of randomness. So I'm sort of philosophically opposed to fudging randomness, even though I sort of accept that it might be necessary sometimes. But in this game, we don't do anything like that, partly because it's very hard algorithm to write, right? Because I need to work out exactly what it is the player needs and then see if they have any such faces on their dice and then roll them. So, no.
Cool, thank you.
It's a good question.
All right. You can continue to think about your questions for Sanny if you have any. But meanwhile, I have a question for you.
Great.
You have obviously done a lot of playtesting to iterate on your game, which is awesome. But how do you really test randomness in playtesting?
You playtest even more because yeah, that is obviously a problem, because randomness is sort of a long-term force that evens out over time, which is sort of the argument behind this: add more randomness to make it more even, right? So I don't have a better answer than just playtest and talk to players and watch players play your game and so on, and then just use your sort of game design intuition to tweak the game until it feels good.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, I don't have anything,
no,
anything
but
better.
It's a good answer. I had no idea if there was a difference between regular playtesting and random playtesting.
I don't think so.
We have another question.
Sure.
Hey, Sanny. Are there times when randomness can affect the player's sense of agency?
Definitely, and I think that's sort of the one of the differences between input and output randomness, because you don't have any agency over output randomness, things that happen after you make a decision. And the lack of agency is, it depends on the genre, right? In strategy games, lack of agency can be a big problem because players they want to feel in control of their fate, right? But in other games, it might not be that bad. So your ratio between input and output randomness, I think, is the way to handle that. Is that answering your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello.
Hello.
When you talked about input randomness and output randomness, it kind of sounded like they were complementing each other, catering to each other's weakness. Like input randomness makes you analyze, while output randomness makes you analyze less. Could you explain why we shouldn't combine the two in games, or if we should?
I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do with the game, I guess. I think if you have both, there could be a conflict between them for a certain decision, even though I think most games have both, just in different proportions. But I think as a designer, thinking about things in terms of input and output randomness is very useful for you, because they bring about different feelings from the player, or the reactions to the player. But are you saying that they are sort of like opposing forces, that if you have one, you must have the other to counteract them, or?
No, not necessarily.
I think they are like knobs that you have for tweaking the feel of your game, and they are sort of independent, but they could possibly counteract one another.
Yeah, okay.
Hi. I had a question about the balancing of the game. So a problem was that players often chose to have increased their score rather than, for example, picking more health or gems. I was thinking of, do the enemies, get stronger during the duration of a run, or do they stay the same? I haven't played the game.
The scenarios are pre-designed, so earlier waves have weaker and less enemies than later waves. So the player is trying to outscale the enemies by upgrading their dice faster than the enemies get stronger. And that's a very definite balancing knob in the game, like how we design the scenarios so that they don't scale too quickly or too slowly. But the randomness in the game will affect this, of course. So if you get very lucky early, then you will get more resources, which allow you to upgrade your dice quicker, and then you will get snowballing, which is why we needed this opposing force that encouraged you to slow your snowball down, so to speak. But we felt that the game worked best when we had very predictable enemies and scenarios, because the mechanics of the game were so random based.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. Thank you for an excellent talk. You talked about you being surprised that people like to manipulate their dice, and I mean, people are obsessed with dice in board games and role-playing games. Can you notice that you have the same obsession for the digital version, or are you aiming for that feeling of the die that has nothing to do with mathematics? It's more religion.
Yeah. I mean, one of the comments that we got in early versions of the game was that it doesn't feel good enough to roll the dice, because this is a two-dimensional game and we are not doing a physics simulation of the dice, which is more satisfying in a way. But I also get very impatient when I play games with 3D digital dice, because I think they roll forever and I just want to get to my turn. But that's something that we got as feedback, and then we added just a very simple animation of the die face flipping around on the screen and then stopping on a result. And we got very positive feedback on that. So people really like that the dice feel like dice. And there's actually an option in the game to turn off this animation and make the game much quicker, because you just get the results almost immediately. And I've never seen anyone actually turn that on, except for me, because I'm impatient, but which surprised me. I thought everyone would play with the animations for a while and then just switch to the faster mode, but they don't do that.
So do you plan to make this 5-sided die not just a crossover side on the D6, but
right, trying to find a geometric shape.
Yeah.
That is a 5-sided. That's for the sequel, I think.
Hi, super nice to hear about this game. Really enjoy it. I was curious because when you were talking about like adding more randomness to sort of mitigate the impact of randomness within the game. From what I understood, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but sort of that assumes that the impact of each and every die roll is the same, basically. And you were sort of alluding to it now in terms of like, well, the early die rolls sort of affect the fate of a run much more than maybe the later ones.
Yeah.
Has there been any like super clear like mechanics or specific roles within the game that has had that like massive impact compared to others, and sort of how have you dealt with balancing those?
You mean to try to avoid this, that they're more important early on? Or?
I mean, the weight of one die roll can have like a massive impact.
Yeah, for sure. I actually think that's a good thing, that sometimes the game sort of, everything slows down and focuses on, okay, this roll is crucial. I need to get a red gem now, or this run is over, which is sort of the game entering into output randomness territory, I guess, but you also had the entire run beforehand to plan for that situation. So I think I see that as a positive, that the game is sort of mulling about for some time and then suddenly it becomes crucial that you roll the right things. So that's not something I've tried to avoid, I tried to sort of ensure that the game has those moments.
Okay.
Was that an answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, great.
Great.
All right. It seems like that was the question. So thank you once again for an awesome talk, Sanny.
Thank you.
A round of applause, please.
Thanks.